Hi, everyone. I'd like to welcome Senator Mark Warner. I'm Dasha Burns, the White House Bureau Chief for Politico. Senator Mark Warner co-chairs the Senate Cybersecurity Caucus and serves as the Vice Chair for the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. Please welcome the Senator.
Thank you.
So a lot of news has already been made here at the Munich Security Conference. I want to start with your reaction to President Zelensky's speech today.
Again, I think President Zelensky made a strong case for us to continue to stand with Ukraine. What's at stake, not just for Ukraine, but for Europe and, for that matter, the world. And, my hope is that, as one of the folks who've been one of the strongest supporters of Ukraine, I wish we'd been able to get the last aid package 6 months earlier. But I still think the Ukrainians, while outnumbered on the front, particularly their drone activity recently, I hope is starting to shift a little bit of the battlefront tactics.
I mean, I think the speeches that everyone here was most anticipating were Zelensky and then Vice President J.D. Vance. And I think the contrast between those two could not be more stark. What do you make of the Vice President's speech, and particularly him telling European allies that their biggest threat was from within?
Well, first of all, I don't think the Vice President spoke for the majority of Americans. I don't think he spoke, obviously, for the majority of Democrats. I don't even think he spoke for the majority of Republicans in terms of how he views the alliance with Europe, how critical it is to America's long-term security. And if everything becomes simply a transaction tactic, then the kind of 70-plus years of alliance that we've had won't stand the test of time. And, I was disappointed by the tone. As somebody, it was our committee, the Intelligence Committee, that did the deepest dive into the Russian intervention in the 2016 elections. It was completely bipartisan. For him to also kind of underestimate the power of misinformation and disinformation candidly shows that I'm not sure he's read much history. The ability of particularly Russia in previous engagements to overthrow regimes based upon misinformation, disinformation campaigns, that is real, and it can be now done at speed and scale with AI tools that make the threat even graver.
To that point, I mean, how do you think Russia received that speech?
I think, if suddenly he or the Secretary of Defense are starting to take negotiating items off the table, how is that anything but positive for Russia? Now, of course, that follows on some of the activities of the Doge group that, again, have been celebrated by Russia, by China, by Iran, as you start to see, for example, 70 years of American soft power through USAID and other institutions, frankly, try to be almost erased or disappeared in what literally are the first 3 weeks of this administration. And again, that's great news for a China or a Russia that can come in and very quickly supplement where America has provided humanitarian or medical aid in countries that are terribly important. And there's not a single person, and current or particularly some of our retired military, that don't strongly stand up for the soft power that foreign aid represents.
Yeah, I mean, let's get into Doge and Elon Musk, because I think everybody here has been reading some of the headlines coming out of that group. When it comes to security, both national and global, how is Elon Musk's work having an impact?
Well, first of all, we don't know yet. We have, the Democrats on the Intelligence Committee have written to try to say, all right, who are these Doge folks? What level of clearance do they have? We've already seen release of classified information in terms of the National Reconnaissance Organization, NRO, a release of the number of employees. That may have just been ignorance for that individual not to realize that that's classified, or the kind of mistake made on sending names of CIA agents.
I mean, those ramifications.
That's crazy. I mean, it shows a complete lack of understanding of how long it takes to get a clearance and how long it takes to train someone to be that careless. And we don't know, the security level clearances of the Doge folks. I do think, our committee's always been bipartisan. Senator Cotton is the chair now. I was chair until recently. I'm the vice chair. We're going to, I believe, jointly try to get these answers. But I have huge security concerns when you have 22-year-olds who may not even appreciate the value of the information they have being so careless. For example, the one individual who was over at Treasury who was 25 and then got fired for a while because of racist comments and then got rehired. This individual, in effect, having visibility into America's checkbook, it's no secret to say that America or any other nation state sometimes does covert actions through another entity. You send out that kind of information and you could destroy operations that literally have taken years to build.
I think all of us who have been reporting on President Trump for a long time know that some Republican lawmakers will say certain things publicly and then will sometimes have a different message behind closed doors. Your Republican colleagues on the Intel Committee, what is that conversation behind closed doors? Is there alarm or are they fully supportive of what Doge is doing? And you don't have to name names, but you can.
Let's put it like this. We are a very bipartisan committee that's always hung together. I was deeply, I raised concerns about the new DNI. I now hope that she's going to be successful.
Tulsi Gabbard. Yeah.
But I think there are a number of folks who've got concerns. And it's going to be interesting to see when and where this breaks. It may not break at the congressional level first. Virginia is home for a lot of federal employees. We've got about 150,000. We have lots of government contractors. We are seeing, for example, on the so-called government freeze that supposedly has been unfrozen, yet we have community health centers around rural Virginia that are shutting down because they didn't get their funds. We have Head Start programs stopping. And my belief is this may start to bubble from the ground up where local Republican elected officials will be the first to break as, we've got projects in Virginia. We've been working for years on economic development that suddenly the money that will make the projects up for grabs. So I think it may start at the local level and move to the state level and then hopefully percolate to the federal level. But of an evidence of how significant this is, and we go back to Russell Vought, who's the new head of OMB, who made his claim, and he's been quite successful, that he wanted to traumatize the federal workforce. But to give you an example of that trauma, senators oftentimes do what's called teletown halls, where you have a firm call out the random numbers and you say, pick up and Senator Warner will be on the line for an hour. You usually get about 3,000 to 5,000 people on one of those calls. Tim Kaine and I did one the other day. We had 71,000 people. 71,000 people? We had virtually one.
Have you ever had that big an audience for a town hall? No offense. I'm sure you're very interesting.
One out of every 10 voters in Virginia. And the thing was, 60,000 of them stayed on for the whole hour. So this is, causing huge concern. And, the unfortunate thing is, even as a senior senator, I didn't have full answers for a lot of their questions.
When it comes to our partners in the intelligence community globally, whether you talk about the Five Eyes Alliance, when you see folks like Tulsi Gabbard getting confirmed, who I know you have concerns about, when you think about the fact that President Trump has had allegations of mishandling classified information, how are those allies thinking about those alliances, those commitments?
Well, remember whether it's Five Eyes or our other alliances, on the intel side, there's no document that says we're going to share this information, you share that information. I mean, I think America's intelligence community is the best, but we get about 50% of our intelligence from our allies. And that exchange of information is totally based on trust. And if that trust is burned, then that information is not going to be shared.
Where does that trust stand right now?
I think that there are, at this point, I think everybody and some of our intelligence partners that I've met with here in Munich, I think they're in a wait-see mode. I think they want to work with the administration. They hope that the norms about protecting classified information will be maintained. They hope that if they share some of the most important information they collect or intelligence they collect, it will be protected. But I think there is a understandable wariness. So I'm thinking folks are all hoping for the best.
What happens if some of those allies decide we're pulling back here?
Well, what happened? They are, intelligence sharing is a two-way street. Many of the allies don't want to lose the intelligence they obviously get from America. But these are the kind of relationships that, once burned, takes a long time to recover. And it'll make, God forbid that happens, it will make the United States less secure if we have less of that sharing.
OPM initially said that national security roles would be exempt from the so-called fork in the road offer, but we've since reported that it's been made available to several intelligence agencies and the DoD. Are you worried about potential hemorrhage of senior officials?
First of all, it's crazy. I mean, I'll be interested to see if you can actually document any savings. But the notional idea that you're going to offer a buyout to a CIA field operative or a buyout to an NSA code breaker and replace him with a 22-year-old coder the way you might be able to replace somebody at a tech company in the Valley shows a complete lack of understanding of what the intelligence community does, how long it takes for people to get this expertise, and it is not interchangeable. So I think there is still the leadership at some of the leadership that's been at some of the agencies I know have been quickly trying to include more people in their excluded category. But to me, from the outside and seeing this, it seems like it's chaotic.
So what have you heard? I mean, you've been here for a couple of days now. What have you heard from some of our allies when it comes to what is happening in Washington, particularly with DOJ and some of the newly confirmed cabinet members?
Well, on DOJ, I think there's as somebody who was a business guy before I was in politics, the idea of a DOJ made a lot of sense to me. There are lots of ways you could bring more efficiency. I mean, in defense contracting, cutting back, making loser pays when you do contract resolution, trying to have more fixed price contracts. That kind of actually where you could bring efficiency, bring innovation, that was what I thought we were going to get instead of a sledgehammer coming at the workforce with people that have virtually no knowledge of even the functions of the agencies they're going after. I mean, and then the backtracking, and we saw all over Department of Energy when they said, oops, maybe we shouldn't fire all the people that take control of our nuclear materials. That kind of lack of knowledge and kind of irresponsible approach, I think it's making people scratch their head. It's obviously making Americans scratch their head. It's making, I think, our Europeans friends scratch their head. It's one of the reasons why, with some of my Republican colleagues, as we were coming over, we thought, and this was before the vice president's speech, that this was the most important Munich conference we'd have to come to try to say, regardless of what may be coming out of the White House, we're not walking away from NATO, we're not walking away from the alliance with Europe, we're not walking away from our trading partnerships.
So that's the message you wanted to deliver here, you thought was important to deliver here. Is that the message that was delivered from the Americans?
Well, it depends on which Americans you're talking about. I mean, I think from the, I'm not sure, and I can't say that I've heard every one of my congressional colleagues, but I don't think any of them have echoed the vice president's comments. Now, again, there may be self-selection. If you come on this trip, you're more pro-NATO, pro-Europe, but I've yet to hear anyone, echo that kind of, and also, I believe, almost naive dismissal of the power of misinformation and disinformation, particularly at scale with technology tools.
I think the challenge for some of our allies here, though, is you have folks like yourself and even some of your Republican colleagues who might be on a similar page at least, but those aren't the folks in the Oval Office, right? Ultimately, the buck stops with President Trump and what Vice President J.D. Vance delivered there. He's speaking for the administration. So how should our allies take your messaging vis-a-vis what they're hearing from the West Wing?
It's hard to believe, but we're not even a month into this new administration. In dog years, it feels like it's been about 20 years.
Yes.
But, I think, as in any new administration, there's going to be competition. I think, folks like Mike Waltz and others who are kind of have a more traditional view of these relationships, I think it's time will tell who wins out. But I'm not sure. Everybody sometimes describes, President Trump as, crazy like a fox or something. But with the vice president's comments, the Secretary of Defense comments, and how they then get backtrack back and forth, it feels, if this is strategy, it's at a level much higher than my ability to compute. It seems to me a lot more just kind of ad hoc, throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what might stick.
So in that environment, what's going on with Democrats? And seriously, I mean, what can you do? How can you reassure your constituents? I've heard from a lot of voters, it feels like a little bit of crickets right now from the left.
I think it's, I think the first week or so, Democrats were reeling. I think since that time, both in terms of virtual unanimity, and listen, I voted for many of President Trump's nominees first term. I worked closely, particularly with Secretary Mnuchin. That first week or so, I voted for a lot of Trump's nominees, the ones that I thought were kind of in the mainstream. I think that has changed. I think you're seeing, a lot of redress to the courts, and the courts so far have stood up for rule of law. I think the brave U.S. attorney in New York standing up against the kind of outrageous attempted pardon of the mayor. I think you're also starting to see, Americans rise up. There was not the kind of resistance movement that happened after the first Trump effort, but I think it's now, the level of voices rising, the amount of kind of output that we're trying to put out has dramatically increased. But
the president's popularity, according to polls, has never been higher. So how do you deal with that?
Let's see where that is in 2 weeks. Let's see where that is as some of these effects of community health centers shutting down, or thousands of your neighbors being put out of work that happen to work for the government. And because the government is not just in Washington, D.C. And one of the things that I'm not sure my European friends know is, the size of the federal workforce in America in 2025 is about the size it was in 1970. It's not grown with this massive bureaucracy. And when people start saying your food inspector is being fired, your park ranger is being fired, that's where I think people will start to feel these effects. But there is, at the congressional level, there are effects when you lose, and when you've got a trifecta of the other party having all three, both houses of Congress and the presidency. And with some of the rule changes is one of the reasons why, 10 years ago when we got rid of the filibuster on nominees and moved it to a 50-vote majority, I thought that was going to come back and bite us. It obviously has. So
it seems like when I've been talking to Democrats, there's sort of a split. There's the idea that you should just be the resistance, say no to everything. Democrats have told me, let them fail, watch them fail. There are others that say, wait a minute, this is real stuff. These are Americans' lives. These are our constituents' lives. Where we do have common ground, we should engage. Where do you fall?
Yeah, I think you've got to find, Donald Trump is president of the United States. I want him to succeed because I want America to succeed. But that does not mean you give him a pass on irresponsible actions around national security. That doesn't mean you turn a blind eye when I believe you're taking illegal actions. I mean, the crazy buyout. I mean, what is the initial sign of any scammer? Call right away. Offer expires at midnight. Well, that was the approach that was taken on the buyouts. There is no money for these buyouts. The federal government in the United States runs out on March 14th. I fear these people are going to be left not only without a job, but probably without the promise of 8 months' pay. And where we, on those kind of actions, we will fight to every level. But I am not going to go into the sense of, if there are things that we can help make sure America stays strong, particularly in terms of the authoritarian threats, I'm not going to resist on those efforts.
So I have to ask, I was in the room during the press conference that President Trump held with Prime Minister Netanyahu, where he announced a plan for Gaza that I don't think any of us expected, the Riviera of the Middle East, as he put it. You met with Netanyahu after that. What was the Prime Minister's take on the plan?
I don't agree with Bibi on a lot of things, but he's a very skilled politician. And for him to try to say, well, maybe there's a merits of good ideas, I think everybody was pretty surprised.
Surprise is
how's that for the understatement of the day,
And it's a very diplomatic answer. Do you get the sense that he is on board with this plan?
Well, some of his willingness to constantly move his government to the right, I don't see any path that has displacement of 2 million Palestinians in Gaza. I also, I continue to be amazed with all of the challenges and some of the internal corruption within the PA, the Palestinian Authority. I'm still amazed that the Palestinian Authority security forces still keep showing up for work each day on the West Bank. And I continue to fear that if someday they all decide we're not going to work, you could have what would make previous intifadas look like nothing compared to the potential for violence on the West Bank. And that kind of, whether it's Gaza or the West Bank, precludes the ability to go ahead and finally negotiate a treaty between Saudi Arabia and Israel. It diminishes the ability to have the Sunni nations in the region, along with Israel, along with America, along with Europe, have a more of a united front against Iran. And I think that's, frankly, to Israel's long-term detriment.
I think one of the challenges for us as journalists covering this administration is flooding the zone is a strategy, and it means that there's so much happening all at once, and you can't give an audience 360 degrees all at the same time, right? So where do you...
What about my job?
Well, it's
the same thing, because
I'm going to ask you that hard question.
Whichever the outrage happens, and how you temper your reaction to things, how you realize this is the kind of classic cliche that it's a marathon, not a sprint. How you reassure people.
You can't have the volume all the way up.
You can't have the volume. The
Yeah.
kind of volume on DEFCON 5 on every item. I think that's what President Trump is doing by flooding the zone. And
so I was going to ask you the question that I can't answer for myself yet, so you probably can't either, but I'll ask it anyway. What to you over the last 3 weeks what have been those moments to you where you've thought, here's where we need to turn the volume up?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think, I guess what I'd say is I expected at the beginning of Trump a flood. I didn't expect a tsunami. And I think after the first, that first week was, we had the initial EOs. They were all kind of in the range of what was expected. The Doge crowd of young folks without clearances getting access to information just so goes against the grain of everything I've learned in the national security community for the last 12 to 14 years. It's just stunning to me. The fact that you could see the 70 years of soft power, and if there were, like in any entity, there are bad programs, but the idea that you're going to erase USAID and all the good it does. I mean, I've spent a lot of time over the last year on Sudan, where more people die every day than Gaza and Ukraine combined. We spent most of last year trying to open up humanitarian channels to Sudan. And candidly, there's no good guys in Sudan. The RSF and the SAF, both in America, could help settle that. The fact that we have American medicine rotting because we can't pay the aid workers to distribute it to the population, and the fact that China can come right behind and for pennies on the dollar play a much more major role. that in my mind is a DEFCON 5, even though it may not be to the most of the American public. So the long-term loss that we have in some of these nations is irreplaceable.
Let's talk really quickly before we wrap up about reconciliation, since there is some movement on the budget plan this week. What is your take on one bill, two bill? Is there a world in which Democrats vote in favor of any of this?
One, do I think there'll be Democratic votes on the Republican reconciliation plans that are out there? No. We've not been invited in. The one thing about this process, if you can see in American politics, whether it was the Trump tax bill, whether it was Obamacare, when you pass something with only one party, that means all you're going to do is relitigate it at some later time. There is a value in bipartisan, not because the ideas are better, but because both parties then own the good and the bad of the program. And when they're talking about literally trillions of cuts and frankly, where all the benefits are going to go to those at the top. And I'm a capitalist, pro-business Democrat, but when all the benefits of these tax cuts are going to go to the top, that's not fair or right. And I don't think, I remember 15 years ago, I had my first gang was around the Simpson Bowles plan when I thought, oh my God, America's going to go hell in a handbasket because we were approaching 17 trillion in debt and how we were going to raise revenues and cut back on spending. We were horribly unsuccessful, obviously. We got called debt Cassandras. Now debt at 37 trillion. Annual debt payments exceed the defense budget. And with this 4 to 5 to 7 trillion that you could see coming out of the reconciliation plan, this is going to bite us. This is, again, an attack on our national security.
I have to ask before I let you go, I think Democrats are still in that audit phase of what happened, right? When you look at the results of the election and the losses among some of those fundamental, long-time Democratic coalitions, whether you're talking about young voters, Latino voters, Black voters, working-class voters. If you can try to avoid the canned answer of we need to meet voters where they are kind of thing. Realistically, what happened?
My sense is, I have not ever lived through a presidential election that had less to do with issues. I don't think getting rid of tax on tips was something that drove the whole election, but that may have been the only new idea that came, frankly, from either candidate. I think the Democrats' brand is really bad, and I think this was an election based on culture. And the Democrats' kind of failure to connect on a cultural basis with a wide swath of Americans is hugely problematic. Every politician goes back to their own story. When I first ran for governor 25 years ago in Virginia, I had a bluegrass band. I sponsored a NASCAR truck. I had Sportsman for Warner. I didn't change who I was, but I said, I appreciate the culture, and I don't think until you have a cultural connection, people are going to listen to you on your issues.
Do you think the rest of your party gets that? The majority of your party gets that?
I think the majority of the party realizes that the ideological purity of some of the groups is a recipe for disaster, and that candidly the attack on over-the-top wokeism was a valid attack. The irony, of course, is, and this sounds like a whining Democrat, which maybe I am, is that, Democrats do some stupid things in 2019, and occasionally one person says one thing. That sticks forever. President Trump can say virtually anything, and it's forgotten within the same 24-hour news period. So that is a whine and a complaint, but it's the reality.
Is there something to learn? Is there something Democrats can learn from President Trump and how he does politics?
Be crazy all the time?
I think crazy would look good on you.
Crazy, but I do think acknowledging the over wokeism. I don't think the kind of notional that some in my party say of, well, we just got to turn out more people. I think they did turn out more people, and folks that we thought were going to go for Democrats aren't. I think a lot of that goes back to culture. Until you can make a cultural connection, I'm not sure people are going to listen to you on issues, and particularly as we now live in a world where the number of people who watch a Politico or read a newspaper or do the normal means of communication or the traditional means of communication is less than 50%. And
Trump maybe we need to get a little crazy too.
And Trump was brilliant Trump was so ahead of his time on sorting that out with a huge, reinforcing network of supporters, followers. That's extraordinary, and the Democrats have got a lot to learn from that.
All right, Senator, thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks,
My
everybody.
colleague Joe Gold is up next.